Here's my summary of this week's reading for Kierkegaard in 3 sentences. Let's see if I can remember. Fuck atheists, fuck pantheists, and it's all about the individual. There you go. That's all I got to say for now.
Go ahead, Sean.
I was just going to say, yeah, that's right. 100%. Go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, I'm right there with you. I think I love the idea of these seminars just being all of us kind of like, yeah, I agree. Like we're all just consistently like, yeah, we're all really on the ball. Like we're pretty smart. Like we really get it. Yeah, good stuff, guys. All right. See you next week. Okay, so I'm doing this annoying like holding my mic thing because of Matthew Squires, who stole a piece of my microphone. So I'm having to use this.
I have not gotten that back yet.
Because the road is gone. I don't know. I think the highway's been imploded or something. He's come up with a million excuses. Or he thinks that if he drives here to give it to me, he will skid off into a ditch and die. So if that does happen, I will look like a jerk. So I'm not willing to take any chances. You know, I don't want to seem wrong. You know, even though he's being a little ninny and he's holding my pieces hostage. But okay, on to Kierkegaard.
You look like a news reporter.
I know, right? I'm like, here's the scoop.
Speaking to you from the Hegel Center.
Yeah, coming to you from the absolute spirit.
There you go.
Yes,
I love it.
Here to deliver to you all the truth, knowledge in the place of truth. Okay, so here's building. Okay, from Nevitt, you said that he said fuck atheists. I'm swearing. I'm sorry. You did it already. He said fuck atheists. Then he said fuck pantheists, and then he said like whatever that third thing is that you said.
It's all about the individual.
It's all about the individual.
I was very curious about. I wrote little Hegel hunters all over the place in that part of the book. Curious how you would deal with that.
Well, here's basically my experience. And I'm glad that I'm glad you've opened up this can of worms, because I'm going to just try and get it out and then we're done. And then I'm going to move on. My basic experience is that Kierkegaard started this section in a very alluring, he was kind of this diary of a seducer thing. He was kind of seducing me. He's kind of pulling me in. It was kind of like, oh, okay. He starts with some pretty reasonable, interesting ideas and critiques. He says, sin of despairing of forgiveness of sin. When he talks about that section, sin of despairing of forgiveness of sin, despairing of the forgiveness of sin, and the sin of doing that, of despairing of the forgiveness of sin. To see forgiveness, to see total forgiveness of sin as impossible. That is the section where I think he immediately kind of got me interested. And Sean, actually, you mentioning that reminded me of a line from the Myth of Sisyphus where Camus has this beautiful passage about Kierkegaard. He describes Kierkegaard as the Don Juan of the understanding, with a thorn in his heart doing pirouettes in a constant darkness. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm all moved. And that's great. But then Kierkegaard pissed me off and I lost all of my sympathy for him when he said, and okay, Nevitt, I get why you wrote Hegel's and whatever, because I wrote that too, because every time he mentions speculative philosophy, it totally goes over the heads of the Philistines, I think that when that's a Myth of Sisyphus. But when he talks about speculative philosophy, it's kind of like Sartre, or no, it's kind of like Ponty covertly critiquing Sartre when he describes Descartes. When Ponty talks about Descartes, he's really kind of critiquing Sartre. And when Kierkegaard talks about speculative philosophy, he's like really directly just trying to kind of critique Hegel's system of speculative philosophy, because I would call Hegel a speculative philosopher. So he says, speculative philosophy is loath to abolish God so as to be its important opposition. And the God concept is thus an ingredient in human importance. And this is a form of the despair of forgiveness of sin. And I saw the connection because I recognize in my conception of Hegel's notion of God, it is a triune pantheistic God, a God concept, which is a God which is really dead. I think that Hegel is a believer in this triune, pantheistic, really dead God, which retains evil within it. And that's really interesting and crazy, but Kierkegaard doesn't care about that. Basically, he's just saying that he starts, that's when he starts talking about speculative philosophy. We haven't even gotten to the part where I actually have problems. That I was interested in. I was like, okay, he's talking about, and he says the pantheism is a problem. He's yeah, like this pantheistic approach can be a problem relative to the doctrines of Christianity. It's like, okay, that's interesting. This is a legitimate critique that I'm actually kind of like, interested in. But then he says that he kind of gets a little bit of an attitude right around when he says, in Christendom, Christianity is taken in vain. And then he says that there's a qualitative split between man and God, which is pantheistically revoked. And I'm like, okay, this is still interesting, right? But then he says, this in speculative philosophy, it's done smugly. It's done with this air of importance in its work. And I'm like, okay, well, you're getting a little shitty, but I can agree. But then for me, okay, so I pinpointed the passage that I have an actual, like a series of critiques on. I'm not going to be able to pull direct quotes from the edition that you guys are doing, but it would be page 119. On page 119 of the book that you guys are using, or the edition that you guys have, on page 119, there's a paragraph that starts, but Christianity has protected itself from the beginning, okay? So within this passage, or within this page, I have a series of problems. I have a series of problems and critiques of what's being delivered to me, and not critiques, but responses from a speculative perspective that I feel, I don't know, kind of informed my reading. So I'm going to read from my edition because I have it all underlined and stuff, and it's going to be a different translation than what you guys have. So good luck. Travis will be able to follow along just fine. So, okay. Basically, I think that from this, where he says, but Christianity has protected itself from the beginning, he's producing this. I really mean this in the most charitable way possible. I mean, I'm trying to say this in the most charitable way possible. It seems as though he produces a straw man of speculative philosophy. It seems as though Kierkegaard produces a series of hypothetical arguments that would be made from a speculative perspective, and then critiques those hypothetical arguments. Basically, I think that Kierkegaard is doing what people do, doing the thing that people do on Twitter all day, which is make up a type of person to get mad at, and then get mad at them, and then talk about how awful that kind of person would be. And I can agree with the idea that that kind of person would be terrible, but I think he's not attacking anybody. He's just kind of barking at a shadow. Yeah, basically, thank you, Sean. That's a pretty crazy reference. So, okay. He says, this is why speculative philosophy promptly alludes to the doctrine of the generation's superiority over the individual. For one cannot expect speculation to acknowledge the concept's powerlessness in relation to actuality. But just as one cannot think a particular human being, so neither can one think a particular sinner. It is possible to think sin, then it becomes a negation, but not a particular sinner. And this is kind of my start of my critiques. He says, for Christianity, sin is a category of particularity. Chase, this is going back to what you said with, his difference with Schopenhauer, where he says that sin is a category of particularity. And counterposed to that, speculative philosophy, i.e. Hegel, I'm just going to say Hegel instead of speculative philosophy, just for the sake of simplicity. Hegel can't think sin, nor individual sinners. Or he can't think individual sins or individual sinners. What he can think is, quote unquote, sin writ large and man in general, because sins and men, and this is the phrasing that he used that I have a very severe problem with, falls below the level of concepts. And that is his like, that is the thrust of his critique against speculative philosophy, is that it deals with concepts while particularity falls below concepts. My immediate question when I read this is, like, aren't you framing particular sinners as a concept in order to talk about it? Are we on the same? Are we talking about particular sinners as a concept, or are you doing something that's somehow different from writing about a thing in a generalized way? Because I think you're writing about it in a generalized way using a concept, and in that sense, your argument cannot prove its conclusion. In that, if we just take that as like one of his premises, that his philosophical approach is superior or undermines speculative philosophy, I would say that it does not guarantee its conclusion. But go ahead, Eric.
I'm just going to make a point here. I think your point is valid, but I think Kierkegaard's underlying point goes untouched. I think the broad gist of what he's trying to say here is that something is lost in abstraction. And I can tell you this in a short sentence. Things are lost in abstraction.
Yeah.
Okay, now things is an abstract concept. Okay, how am I getting this? How am I communicating this idea to you except through some medium of abstraction? Okay, it doesn't negate my earlier point.
That's fair, but then it wouldn't be that does not, it doesn't hold from that point. It doesn't hold that speculative philosophy or a philosophy oriented around concepts used to communicate is thus invalid.
I don't know that he would say it's invalid in all regards. I'm kind of like with Eric here. I don't deny at all that a big target is Hegel, and some of it is specifically crafted toward Hegel. But as I've said in the chat, I think the broader target here is believing that reducing knowledge to pure conceptual analysis will give you a lock on the truth, capital T. And I think that's still an insight that is good to bring up today. And so, like when he's talking about, so his major thing here is that when you're talking about the deepest, the most fundamental features of human existence, those engage only and exclusively my individual existence in relation to God. This doesn't mean that in fact, he says, for example, he thinks you can talk about animals in general through concepts, which is just that the human animal is not merely an animal, but we are individuals. And so he doesn't at all, I don't think, say that a philosophy that's heavily grounded in conceptual analysis is completely illegitimate. I think he's just saying the most crucial, existentially important features of human existence deal with this concrete individual's relationship to the concrete individual existence of the divine. I think that's the primary point, and he's rejecting, especially, so for example, abstract ethical analyses that say, you can get to the absolute truth of ethics through purely conceptual analysis. I think again, he would say, well, that's that, I don't know what, there's those three ways of life, but that's maybe the ethical, but it's not the religious, because the ethical religious life is the one that is grounded in this radically individual relationship to the divine. And so again, I don't think he's saying every kind of conceptual analysis is bad. It's just the most important as far as human existence, where we stake our very existence. That is where conceptual analysis fails. And if you rely on it, I don't know if he would say if you rely on it at all, or if you rely on it exclusively. I can hear what he's talking about when he's talking about the Christian community, because even in those fundamentalist communities that I grew up in, that claim to be talking about the individual relationship with God, they end up talking in really general terms about humanity and mankind. And when you hear these sermons, it sounds like it's not that I have this direct, radical connection with God. It's like, you are one of these kinds of beings called human. And as a species, this human being has this misaligned relationship with God. And so you need to move from this class of being, which is the unsaved, to this class of being, which is the saved and does have a relationship with God. And so like you're moving from one conceptual domain to another conceptual domain when you're saved. And so I think, one of his, when he's complaining about Christianity, that's one of his complaints, is that Christian theology, as it's preached from the pulpits and as people conceive of it, is still this, conceptual analysis in which I personally have no immediate terrifying stake. He's, in these passages, he's trying to raise raise the stakes so high that I feel terrified and existentially threatened in my very existence. I mean, that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to get me out of this conceptual safe mode where I think of myself as a kind of creature and force me into this deadly, this life and eternal life and death situation that I personally am in. And I think that's the real thrust of all this focus on the individual.
But at the same time, okay, let's agree then that he's not completely throwing away conceptual or speculative analysis, because he has to, he comes crawling back. He's got to use those concepts. I'm just saying that to be shitty. I don't. He's going to rely on concepts in order to communicate an idea about a concept. We'll agree on that. But he is critiquing an over-reliance or an exclusivity to that conceptual analysis. I can agree with you there, or even just that he's possibly doing that. But let's take it one step further. You said that the thrust of his argument is still preserved through my critique. Well, I have more critiques. And I think that those critiques are not critiques, but again, I don't want to say critiques because I'm not smarter than Kierkegaard. I'm just saying I have responses that are coming from a speculative perspective, which is a fun phrase. So on the very next page, let's see, it's actually that same paragraph, but Christianity has protected itself from the beginning. In that same paragraph, he talks about even speculative philosophy would have to admit that since sin in effect falls below the level of the concept, not to prolong this discussion on this for the sake of argument, he says, okay, the main difficulty is something else. So this is his main difficulty. Let's talk about that. If you want to talk about his main argument, let's go to what he says is his main argument, because I tend to believe him. I hope he's not a liar. Let's say that he's correct, that he's being truthful when he says the difficulty is something else, that speculative philosophy pays no heed to the fact that sin involves the ethical, which always points in the other direction from speculation and takes directly opposite steps, for the ethical does not abstract from actuality but absorbs itself in it, operating essentially by means of the speculatively neglected and scorned category of the individual. Well, here's my take on that, or my reading of that. And it's first, if we just take a basic lesson from Kant, if we're going to take anything from Kant at all, it's that ethics only exists at all because of our disconnection, or the disconnection between reality in itself and actuality. And thus, ethics is not purely concerned with the actual and the individual, but it only comes from a space or a gap or a cut or a split between reality in itself and our phenomenal actuality or whatever, which, by the way, the term is muddled one page later when he says that God's concepts contain actuality itself, which to me reads as reality in itself. So he's talking about reality in itself as being the realm of ethics, which, and then he's saying that concepts are disconnected from that. But my basic, yes, but my basic point is that Kant would say ethics does not come from the noumena. It comes from the split between the phenomena and the noumena. It comes from our ability to act and to choose, to not be puppets. And then another critique is that, or another response is that for sin or the ethical to only concern actuality, I think that this goes against even Hume. Hume says that aren't ought statements, that a thing ought to be this or that way, that this or that thing ought to be this or that way. Isn't that a pure abstraction from actuality and cannot be discerned from reality in itself, or phenomenal reality either, or the way things are, or matters of fact, using Hume's terms? The basis for ethics, as far as I'm aware, at least from a series of different writers, from a series of different perspectives, is not this pure embeddedness in actuality, be it phenomenal actuality, as Kierkegaard seems to be implying, or in actuality in itself, as he seems to be implying in the following page, right? So that's my basic argument that I still think that his like core argument or reproach against conceptual analysis or Hegel, if we could again be brief, it doesn't hold for me yet, perhaps because I haven't been convinced by one of you lovely gentlemen. But my second thought is that this notion, I think that there's this attachment to the notion of there's this thing lost in our conceptual analysis, right? There's this this intimate existential truth or experience that is constitutive of the subject, that is missed out or lost in the leap from a sin or a particular sinner or a particular person, right? A leap from that to sin and man and all this shit. Yes, there's something lost. Or perhaps something, I mean, and I don't know of anybody that really takes that leap. I wouldn't read them. But I think that Kierkegaard, in arguing that a person like this exists who does this, yes, I would say that something is lost. And the thing that's lost is this intimate, internal, humanist experience. But here's my, again, speculative philosophy says this. At least my speculative philosophy, my reading of speculative philosophy, it's that there's this phrase that I think runs through Kierkegaard's reproach against speculative philosophy, but it's an implied phrase, or a way that I could put it into a phrase would be, okay, Hegel, you can never take from me my most intimate feelings and internal experiences. And okay, this is echoed in Blade Runner 2049 when Deckard is being questioned by Niander Wallace, and he says, "Oh, how do you know that you weren't designed? How do you know that you weren't engineered to fall in love with Rachel? How do you know that your love wasn't just a product of another man's plan?" And he says, "I know what's real." I think that Deckard saying, "I know what's real," I think that is an example of somebody saying, you can never take from me my most intimate feelings and experiences of existence because I am doing pirouettes in the dark. But I think that this is the constitutive fantasy of being a humanist subject. I think that for being a humanist existential subject, this is a constitutive facet. And if I could speak of it in like kind of cut to the chase, it's a constitutive fantasy. Lacan argues that when Lacan talks about the master-slave dialectic, when he was really early in his career and talking about Hegel a lot, he said that this idea of the most intimate internal experience of the individual being this core of what makes us who we are and makes us authentic living beings that deserve dignity and respect and all this stuff because we have passions and hopes and dreams and fears. Lacan's wording on this is that the analyst, the position of the analyst, and thus the position of Hegel, or the conceptual analyst, is that they can and in fact must deprive the subject, be it the individual subject in the analyst's office or the subject proper, in terms of the subject as such or whatever, to deprive the subject of this regulatory fantasy, this fantasy that regulates their experience and makes them feel kind of okay. The unconscious as far as it stands in Lacan and Freud, and as it stands in Hegel as this thing called determinate negations, the unconscious is inaccessible phenomena. It's phenomena that are inaccessible. It's not an objective mechanism that regulates phenomenal experience that puppets us like a master on strings. Subjectivity is not this irreducible fantasy. This irreducible fantasy of I am a human being with passion and love and all these, saucy feelings. He says that is not constitutive of subjectivity at all. Subjectivity, or what characterizes subjectivity as subjectivity, is the gap itself between this fantasy and actuality or reality, or the real, if we could put it that way. Fantasy becomes inaccessible to the subject in its constant striving to say, no, I'm a real boy, and I have real feelings, and I really love, and I really cry, and why don't you care about me, Hegel? Why are you so dismissive of me? That's because the subject only says that because it feels disconnected from this constitutive fantasy, and that constitutive fantasy is thus kind of threatened as a stable ground for our certainty or our experience and our drives and our will. This substantial sort of support for all of our motivations and actions. The reason that all my skepticism will never lead me to be so skeptical that I'll walk out of a 6-story window because I'm skeptical that gravity exists. Because no. At the end of the day, I have this real, internal, personal, humanist fantasy of what I am. I'm a dignified human, right? But that is only so heavily attached to because the fantasy is inaccessible to the subject. This lack of a fantasy is an empty subject. And this empty subject produces an impossible relationship between itself and the phenomena that are inaccessible to it. There is a series of inaccessible phenomena that are in a non-relationship to an empty subject. And this non-relationship between an empty subject and inaccessible phenomena constitutes I would call it a decentering, a radical decentering of subjectivity. And I think that when we talk about things like the digital age threatening, subjectivity, like, oh, we might lose what it means to be human. That's not because we're losing this beautiful dream of being noble savages, picking berries and grooming one another, or of writing beautiful poetry by candlelight. I don't think it's because we're losing that. I think that it's because we are losing the very element of decenterment which constitutes subjectivity proper. And this is not like, I'm not saying that, Kierkegaard couldn't have known all this or couldn't have thought all this. This is hundreds of years of thought and theory past Kierkegaard. No, this is Hegel. This is Hegel. If you read him really closely. My basic point is that this intimate self that Kierkegaard is arguing is already lost as soon as Kierkegaard starts talking about it, and Kierkegaard is chasing his own tail. Or Hegel would say that because Hegel's a douchebag, and I'm not a douchebag. I would never say that. Hegel would say that because he's dismissive and rude. But in a way, Kierkegaard is chasing his tail, looking for some sort of certainty and hope, and feeling the thorn in his heart at the fact that there is no hope and there is no substantial ground for our experience. We live in a grounded existence, and nature, qua the domain of organic and balanced reproduction of vitality and being. And then if I could use nature as God, the basic principle is that this either does not, it's not that it does not exist, is that there is no domain like this. That's the big other. There is no big other. And Hegel even knew this when he argued for his pantheistic triune God defined by negativity and evil within the triad between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. God has a dark side. And then, actually, to go one step further, Kierkegaard said one other thing that really pissed me off. He said, because God would want order, right? Because God is not a God of confusion. And Hegel would say, what are you talking about? The very notion of the absolute otherness that is present between God and us directly, like, necessarily implies that God has a dark side, a part of God that God does not know. Yes, Kierkegaard's quoting scripture, but like, I mean, he's not reading too far into it, or not far enough. I mean, I'm just saying that, like, on the ethics point, I don't buy it. And then on this idea that conceptual analysis destroys or loses the reality of our internal, intimate experiences that define the truth and actuality and whatever, I don't buy that either. I feel as though it's missing the real problem, which is recognition in the other, for Hegel, to put it in, and which is why Hegel is often called the philosopher of recognition. Anyway, Jesus, got my blood pressure up.
So here's I mean, this will not be a complete response, but so I don't claim to, to answer all those criticisms. One thing, and this is sort of a standard phenomenological response to other parts of the tradition. Why does the phenomenological tradition start with subjectivity? And they would say it's because that is the they're getting this from Descartes, although they also reject the thinking thing as a substance. But they say that what I actually have immediate access to, the only thing I have immediate access to, is in fact my subjective experience, and everything else is always and forever speculative. And so to say, so I guess someone might say, well, if you call my internal experience a fantasy, that's begging the question. You're assuming that it's a fantasy because you're already taking a stand outside that experience of subjectivity and assuming, so for example, I mean, this isn't what you're talking about, but the contemporary physicalism that says, well, my consciousness is nothing but a product of neurophysical processes. Well, you can say that, but how would you ever prove that? In order to prove that, I would have to be able to stand outside my subjectivity, look at my neural processes, look at my consciousness and go, oh, look, the one comes from the other. But you can't do that. The only thing I have immediate access to is in fact my immediate subjective experience. And so that's why, that tradition starts there as they would say, the only legitimate place to begin from. And then if you say, well, that can't be right because of these, your consciousness is a function of subconscious processes or sociological processes, you're always taking a stand outside subjectivity, which at least in the phenomenological tradition would say is always suspect, because you can't, you're guessing. As soon as you step outside your own subjectivity, you're making these guesses. You're fabricating models, and that maybe that's where the real fantasy is. And then as far as, and I don't really understand Lacan at all, so a lot of the stuff you said, I'm not qualified to respond to, but in terms of this, I forgot what you called it, but this sort of fundamental lack at the core of subjectivity, I have a hard time denying that, even on a phenomenological basis, but there are phenomenological explanations of that. And then there are also other speculative answers. And so now this might be a place where you could actually criticize Kierkegaard, because it seems to me that he recognizes that self is fundamentally, has this fundamental lack. And that's why the self as despairing is fundamentally unstable. And it's never stable. And therefore you have to find a place of stability outside the self, namely in God. But you could say there's a speculative element there, right? Because you're saying he's speculating, because I mean, I think he would have to say, he wouldn't call it speculation, I guess he would call it a leap. But the fact that you have to take a leap outside your own subjectivity in order to ground your subjectivity says that you can't find all the resources you need from within subjectivity, which again sounds like, and I don't know, again, maybe it's not the same thing Lacan's talking about, but it's at least an admission that there is some sort of lack at the core, at the very core of subjectivity itself. But there's, that's why I think Sartre says you have to stake your life on a project, and so on. So, I think someone like Sartre would say probably, yeah, there is this, and I mean, I think Kierkegaard would agree that consciousness is fundamentally ungrounded. So I think you're right about that. I mean, I think he would agree with that. But then he's going to say, you have to take the stand on God. Sartre's going to have to say you're going to have to take the stand on some fundamental choice you make. So I don't think there's a necessary deduction from saying there is this fundamental lack or hole or instability in subjective consciousness to saying subjective consciousness is completely a fantasy or illusory. And it, and I think what, part of what Kierkegaard is trying to claim, this whole business about intensification of consciousness and intensification of sin and intensification of despair, it is sort of, this sort of concretizing of the self, and I don't sort of concretizing it as a way of dealing with this fundamental vacuum or vacancy at the core of subjectivity. And I think his thing is you can only take that so far, and at some point you've got to reach outside and grab hold of something. Whereas, maybe someone like Sartre would say, no, you can, in fact, intensify that core of subjectivity until it is a stable entity. And maybe that's what the whole purpose of if there's a spiritual journey for Sartre, that's what it would be. And then for Nietzsche, Nietzsche's, I think, also agrees that there's this sort of, this business about the society of the drives, and myself is just this sort of constant battle between these all internal drives and so on. But then on my reading, he's going to say, yes, but if you're fortunate enough, if you're not, you're just sort of fucked. But if you're fortunate enough, you have this dominating instinct that can create a coherency and structure in your soul. And you can, again, sort of intensify or concretize, or as Nietzsche says, create your own self. You can construct. Now, of course, Sartre or Kierkegaard would say that's a stupid thing to say. But I guess what I'm saying is you can acknowledge that there is this sort of lack, and yet nevertheless maintain that there is a real subjectivity, and that it's not a fantasy. And then finally, just to reiterate my earlier point, to claim that you can take a stand outside and critique subjectivity and say, no, subjectivity is really a fantasy because it's a product of unconscious forces or sociological forces or historical forces. You're taking a stand where you can't really stand. You're making guesses and so on.
I'm sure you really desperately want to respond to that, Hunter, so I apologize, but can I jump in? Sorry. So one of the things, I think that all of that analysis makes sense, Nevitt, except I think that you're underselling a certain key element of phenomenology, especially I think in the way that Merleau-Ponty treated it when we read those particular books. And I think in particular, it's the understanding that while subjectivity does have a lack, that lack is a thing that is directed fundamentally at the world and at its interactions with the world, right? I think that an element of that becomes, I think really agrees with Hunter's analysis. And I will say, Hunter, I think I agree with like 90% of what you said. I'm definitely on your side with this one. I think Kierkegaard is barking at straw men. Am I allowed to use that terminology? But I think that in particular, one of the few things I'd quibble with is I actually think you've given Kant more credit than you should, because I think Kant just gets this completely wrong. I think Kant thinks that there is this sharp division between the noumena and the phenomena, and that ethics is something that is generated from the noumenal qualities of the human. Now, I think he's wrong, and I think that the way that you're presenting him makes a lot more coherent sense. But that's not my understanding of Kant, if that's a fair criticism of what you said. So I think that this external directedness is a critical element here, specifically because what we're trying to treat individualistically with a force like God, or a force like the way that Sartre is trying to sort of satisfy a lack by total loyalty to some sort of like project or thing that you've chosen, is that the lack isn't a need that needs to be plugged. The lack is the very thing that subjectivity is for. Subjectivity is a sense, a feeling that is directed towards a world that's trying to understand it. And so, of course, there's a lack. There's the absence of a complete or a completeness or a wholeness, because this thing has to be unstable because it is interacting with something, and it's the process of the interaction with that thing that is determining what the thing is. And I think in particular, this is, for me, this is why I have a lot of problems with perspectives that really want to focus on the necessity of free will, right? And the way that free will is this necessary thing, for instance, to begin to talk about ethics. One of the lessons that I take away from this is me bringing something that I already believed into it, but what is it? Blade Runner 2049? I always forget the numbers. Is in fact, it doesn't really matter where the origin or source of your desires or preferences or loyalties are, because you can't fundamentally escape them, even if you're aware of their origins or like the things that produce them. I think that it's a mistake to believe that it is sort of just assuming the idea that free will exists in some way, to go, oh, well, if I knew that my desires, my preferences, my loves were the product of things outside of myself, were the product of things that weren't me and I didn't have control over, that would somehow make them illegitimate. Well, the point of the matter is that what you care about and what you desire and what you love is a product of your subjective experiences intermeshed with an external world. And ultimately, there isn't any way to escape that. There isn't any way to escape the fact that there are these deterministic relations that are playing into that process, but that doesn't take away at all from the force of them. And I think that this is this Christian straw man assumption that I see in, I don't think it's limited to Christianity. I get the sense that this is a constant thing from like sort of libertarian free will advocates that just want to say, no. If it's not purely, if I am not a miniature God, if I am not, and I think that Kierkegaard is playing this in a weird way that even seems even more incoherent, because ultimately then the like capacity of me as a mini God to be able, like, is somehow being grounded in like the Christian God, and like, the mechanisms of how this is functioning is even weirder and more abstract. But for me, I don't really care what the source of it is. I think that this is a fundamental misinterpretation of a perspective by just insisting. It is circular reasoning. It's a circular argument. It's saying an ethical system would have to work like mine. The facts that people are presenting here would invalidate my ethical system, so therefore those facts must be wrong. Well, that's no way to argue, and we know that's no way to argue from like starting with Socrates, right? Like this is a weird conceptual way to approach this. If the model of ethics that you're presenting doesn't make sense given what we know about reality, about causality, based on the speculations that we've reached from our subjective experiences of the world and from our own subjective impulses, then you need to come up with new conceptions of how ethics is supposed to work and what exactly you are going to find valuable. And this is like, this is where I think, not to be a broken clock or whatever, but I think this is where Camus is useful, right? And particularly as a critic of Nietzsche in a certain kind of way. But anyways, I will shut up and let either Chase or Hunter, or if Never wants to respond to me or whatever.
I don't even know if I really. So I wanted to say some stuff about when you're talking about, the concept and actuality and whatnot, but I don't know. I kind of want to just let Hunter respond and then go next, but that may be a while. I'll just do that. Here, Hunter, you can go ahead.
Okay, I'll try and be brief. Travis, I'm so sorry. I feel like you're my keeper. I feel like every time that I talk too long, I feel like I'm acting out, and you're like my zookeeper that's got me on a leash. And you're like, oh God, he's doing it again. Okay. So I just have some basic responses. First, Hegel said that you can never stand on your own shoulder or view the world from outside of the world. So Hegel's very much in agreement with you there, Nevitt. But I think that the notion of standing outside subjectivity is not what Hegel's goal is, nor Lacan's. It is to be aware of its constitutive characteristics. And I think that that's different from standing outside of it and then gaining a holistic interpretation of its entirety. Because I think to gain a holistic interpretation or understanding of its entirety would be to approach something like the capital R real, which would be an impossible real thing that we cannot approach. So I think that's just like, I don't think Lacan or Hegel are trying to do that. And I think they're recognizing that they can't do that. And so we're all buddy about that. But I wanted to, Sean, you said something really important and revolutionary when you said that it's not about like you don't have to go totally outside of something in order to recognize its originary features or like its constitutive conditions. Like we live in a world with oxygen so that we can breathe, or we live in a world of deterministic causality that brings us into being in some sense. There's some sort of condition that allows our experience to go forward, and we can recognize that. Basically, I want to also point out that it's not that, Never, just to respond to something specific that you said, it's not that there is these outside products that are determining subjectivity, and subjectivity is just a fantasy that is determined by history and culture and society and all this outside determining factors. I don't think that is the case. I think that if we can talk about the big other as here, let me move my hair. If we can talk about the big other in I'm going to use three terms that are all kind of synonymous with each other within this conceptual analysis, and that's the big other, the unconscious, and I would call absolute otherness. Absolute otherness between myself and a thing, where there's a thing that's absolutely other to me, and then my unconscious and the big other, which would be a grand example of an absolute other, like God, a substantial basis of support for all of my actions and thought. So Lacan is very clear when he says there is no big other. And it's not that the big other does not exist. He does not say the big other doesn't exist, because that would imply that it doesn't exist, but while it doesn't exist, it only exists in its effects, or it would open up room for critiques like that. And I think that's why Lacan's very, very careful when he says there is no big other, even though he's also arguing that the big other is like a constant, overwhelming force in our experience. So there is no big other. It's not just a virtual or symbolic fiction existing only in its effects. There is no big other means that the big other cannot persist as a coherent symbolic fiction. And this means that the big other, i.e. my unconscious, i.e. the thing that I'm absolutely other to, is thwarted by inconsistency and immanent antagonisms. And we can evaluate those immanent antagonisms through Hegel's system of immanent critique, which is also called dialectics. But the big other is another name for the unconscious, in that the unconscious is not this alienated substance that controls me or determines all of my actions or controls the subject. Let's just say that not me, but the subject. The unconscious is not an alienated substance controlling the subject. The unconscious, and in fact, this is Freud's definition, which Lacan used. The unconscious is the inconsistency in reason itself. In all reason proper, from top to bottom, there is an inconsistency, and that inconsistency is the unconscious, or the big other, or the thing that we're absolutely other from, despite all of our reasoning. And okay, I'll give you a practical example of kind of what I'm talking about, and where I think Kierkegaard and I would split off, maybe. Actually, maybe Kierkegaard and I would agree on the first couple basic points. Also, yeah, I think Sartre denies the existence of the unconscious because he argues that I just think that he reads the unconscious as an alienated substance, like a lake. He called it a lake of unthinkable thoughts that rests within me, that is impossible and absurd. And I agree, that idea is impossible and absurd. Thoughts that are unthinkable, how silly. But the notion of unconscious that I think I've seen Sartre respond to has not been this more conceptual approach to the unconscious. But through this conceptual approach to the unconscious, we can say things like, people, okay, here's where Kierkegaard and I think would agree, or Hegel and Kierkegaard. People, I hear people say, okay, Matt Squires is a real example of a kind of person who says this sort of thing. He says, like, he's an artist, he's a musician, right? And he writes poetry too. And all kinds of musicians and artists and poets will tell you after they've created their art or their poetry or their music, they'll say, oh, the art was created by something speaking through me. It was this thing speaking through me, this a collective unconscious or whatever. This is what is rejected in this reading of subjectivity as this thing relative to the unconscious, or connected to the unconscious as the irrationality or the inconsistency within itself. Although the subject is, yes, like subjects are decentered, and we can agree on that. We can all agree on that. And therefore, maybe Kierkegaard would say that God is speaking through sometimes. Maybe when he's, I mean, maybe if Kierkegaard got really high and really enjoyed a poem, and then he said, "Oh, it's like God was speaking through him," in some sense. I don't know if he'd ever say that, but maybe Schelling would, or at least that the Dionysian spirit was speaking through them, or the tiger and the panther pulling the cart. He would say that's happening. So, although the subject is decentered and the tiger and the panther are pulling the cart, right? Nothing is centered in that way. There is absolutely nothing that is centered in the way that we see subjectivity as not being, which is a fucked up way to say that. But the only thing speaking through me is an inconsistent pandemonium, and there's no big other that is a consistent, coherent, symbolic edifice or fiction. Oh, don't worry, Chase. You're already in trouble. There's no substantial support for our experience. And in this, I could keep going, but we would say, oh, well, that's what God is. God is the substantial experience of our, God is the substantial support for our experience. But that would launch me into the discussion of Lacan's reasoning for saying that our belief in God, even if all of the things that we believe in God for, even if every single thing we say about God is completely 100% factually accurate, it is still a fake. Our belief is still a fake. It is still a pathological exercise. Similar to if a jealous husband were like, my evil wife, she's cheating on me, I know it. And then you say, oh, dude, you sound kind of unhinged. And then he's like, no, I know it's true. I just know it. And then, lo and behold, the next day, the news comes out. He was right about everything. His jealousy would still be pathological. There would still be a constitutive impetus for the saying, for the expression of the jealousy, for the pathological exercise of faith in the jealous impulse, I guess. Which is the exact opposite of Kant's reading of pathology, where, Sean, you and I agree, Kant really screwed the pooch in some areas. And one of those areas is in pathology, because I think if we follow his definition of pathology, everything is permitted, and like all of my hedonistic desires technically fall in like the good. At least Edgar Allan Poe said so. But if we follow kind of Lacan's notion of pathology, it's not that. It's based on an ungrounded I guess delusion of knowledge in the place of truth. But yeah, if I wanted to keep talking down this line of reasoning, I would start talking about like absolute knowing. I would eventually, which I guess every Hegelian, right? Okay.
We can't get there yet, though. We have to go through the whole dialectic, right? You can't just skip the whole book and start reading absolute knowing. I mean, that's actually what I did, but it didn't work. As I don't wait. If I know that I don't have absolute knowing, oh my god, I think I just figured it out. Okay, I guess we can just end the seminar, right? Yeah, I think so. Okay, yeah. I like Travis's reaction the best. Just like slow shake of the head. Just
if
no.
I had the power, it's a good thing I don't, I would have ended this video right now. I would have just ended the meeting. So never. What I'm telling you is never give me the power to do that.
Yeah, I probably would have too. Before just like pull jokes, I would just like pretend to rage quit Zoom meetings and then eventually come back and just be like, I was just joking. Yeah, it's all good. I'm just gonna be egoistic, and I just want to talk about concepts and actuality or something. I don't even really know, but so I think I feel Travis's judgment's weighing heavy on me. This is, yeah, maybe Travis is. So Travis is like the criteria of judgment that like is reflecting back my own subjectivity. Oh my, yeah. Luckily, Travis is not omniscient. Otherwise, that would be really bad. Or wait, that would be good because then I'd have like a higher degree of individuality or subjectivity, right? So that would be good. Okay. So yeah, I think I kind of agree and sort of disagree with pretty much like everything I've heard. But one thing I think I do agree with or at least one way that I would critique Kierkegaard's idea of individuality. I think he's definitely right in saying that there is something kind of below the concept, but yet also philosophy has to use these concepts. But then kind of the whole thing about language and, like the very, simple sign, signification referent thing is that you can use a concept to refer to something that is theoretically, conceptually below the concept itself. And, he's using that idea. And I think philosophy and just thought itself has to use those ideas. But yet, I think if he just kind of goes with that, a lot of people would maybe agree with it. But the thing is, he says then that, oh, but God is what knows the concepts of individuality that is below the concept that humans have. Well, then what are these concepts that there's so basically does all knowing happen through concepts then, but just humans don't have those that extra grain of particularity of concepts, and only God does? That seems kind of strange. But then that's also kind of that's the whole thing of this traditional picture that reality is basically just these degrees of basically there's the fullness of being and knowledge, which are the same thing, and then there's just all these shitty ways of misunderstanding, basically just negations of it. So it seems like he would fall into this kind of ontotheology thing where you basically just, oh, I'm not God, I'm imperfect, so I only have bad knowledge of things. That's why I can't understand anything really fully, completely. I don't know. I think that's kind of, that's not really how concepts are supposed to work, really, in the sense of really, yeah, there's problems with that. But okay, the other thing is individuality. Okay, yeah, that's a concept. Individuality is a concept, but that seems to be pretty much, you can really grasp, I think, the kind of, there's nothing below the concept in the individuality, I think, that he's really getting at. Although if his, and I'll give Hunter, I guess, that it's a straw man to say that, oh, Hegel or, speculative philosophy only deals with man as a concept, all these capital, these grand nouns and all these things, which, Plato gives the impression of that's how you get knowledge, is you must know man and all this stuff. And it's interesting that he talks about the crowd and all these trivial people in ways that I agree with this criticism. I think pretty much everybody understands that there's people just totally engaged with trivial particularities. Yeah, that's also that was his criticism, though. So he wants to criticize people that are, engaged in particularities, but then also people that are engaged in these grand man as a concept, you know? And so he's somewhere in the middle by basically saying, okay, the concept basically of the individual. And I think that's really where he's getting at, but that's something that's not itself really below the concept. But then that's not really the point. It almost doesn't even matter, because I think he's just trying to kind of zero in on that, and something that, yeah, he can't, you know, talk to me and be like, Chase, you reading this right now. Of course he can't do that. So basically he's got to do something in order to try to get us to, oh, I get it, me as a person. Oh, that's concrete, that's actual. But then, yeah, you can't actually conceptualize that in a way without, well, God could write in a book and be like, whoever's reading it, it would say their name as they're reading it. Oh, wow, that's cool. But yeah, I think the thing is, though, that his idea about individuals, so he really seems to start with this idea of the individual. It has to be an absolute agent, pretty much, in order to really be responsible before God, in order to receive judgment by God, and to be a sinner. And basically everything outside of that questions that is basically, you can't do that. You just have to simply accept it as the paradox that it is. And he's really starting with that. But then the thing is, okay, that idea of individuality is presupposing a whole bunch of other things. And I think what his problem here is that he's not really fully kind of going along with the consequences of that idea of individuality. And his own idea of the individual is that it's a relation. And I think this goes into what Sean was talking about with, you know, phenomenology and Merleau-Ponty thing, is that the individual, to work in actuality and as a concept, it has to refer and relate to other things. And that's something where, you know, do you then lose absolute agency at that point? Does the whole thing start to fall apart once you see that the individual is what is actually the kind of irreducible remainder that's below the concept, is basically the way that all these concepts are mixed together. All these concepts actually only work by referring to each other in a system. And, you know, you can talk about the way that structural linguistics talks about this, but I'm sure you guys are familiar with that. I don't think his idea of individual can just work on its own the way he really wants it to work, in order to preserve that notion that this thing deserves absolute judgment because it is an individual and it will be judged as an individual. And I think that's where he starts his whole philosophy, and that's where he argues from that, and that's how he sees the individual. And I think that's where basically he goes wrong. But am I presupposing something by saying that? I'm not sure, but I think all we can really do, yeah, I think there's definitely a problem when we try to, we're always going to be talking past each other when we start with these different presuppositions and then try to judge the other presupposition based off the other one. You're always going to be talking past each other. The only thing you really do to critique something is say, okay, given these, you know, premises, does the conclusion really follow, you know, or does this basically contradict itself? Does it fall apart on its own merit, you know? I think he doesn't follow the whole relational activity of the self enough. Yeah, exactly. Immanent critique. Yeah. And that's where he basically, his premises, in order to try to get to work, they actually, you know, that the individual is a relation, okay, but then it's just this very non-relational relation between one thing, this absolute otherness of God. Yeah, I don't know. I'm probably just repeating myself by now, so I'm going to stop.
So I had a couple things. So I'm not sure, maybe this is not what Kierkegaard is talking about, but I'm recalling Nietzsche's Nietzsche's comment that there are no things. There's just, he didn't say it this way, but the way I think about it, all there is in our phenomenal existence, our phenomenal experience is variations of colors and textures and densities and this sort of thing. And then the rational mind, in order to understand things, carves the world up into types. And, so in that truth, whatever it is, in an extramoral sense, truth and lies, he says, if you look at the notion of a leaf, there is, the way you come up with the idea of a leaf is by looking at these things and forgetting all the differences, but there's that's all there are differences, but that's how you come up with a concept. And so in some ways I'm thinking of Kierkegaard like that, maybe he thinks all there, yeah, I did not mean to kind of slip that little, but yeah, maybe that's, I don't know, seems to fit. But if, maybe Kierkegaard would say, maybe there are just really individuals, and then our concepts falsify reality by pretending like we can group different individuals into categories. I don't know if he would go so far as Nietzsche, at least on my reading goes, and saying there aren't even individuals, there's just stuff. But, so on an epistemological level, that's not that difficult for me to say or to think. And then maybe what Kierkegaard thinks is that if you look at everything besides, he probably assumes that nothing has an interior life except for human beings. And if that's the case, then conceptualizing cats and dogs and trees and rocks is not that bad. Sure, you're going to be throwing away certain particularities of individual things, but there are some real commonalities that really do, so in other words, every cat, maybe Kierkegaard would say, does have certain essential features that makes it a cat. But because human beings have an interior life, as soon as you start doing with that human being, to human beings, you're sort of radically falsifying what it means to be a human being. Because when you start categorizing human beings, you're categorizing them in terms of these externally visible characteristics. You're completely abstracting away any internal life. And that's what fundamentally makes human beings human. One thing I agree with Chase on is that I get the impression, especially from this book, that Kierkegaard thinks the fundamental interior characteristic that is most important for his purposes is free will and freedom. And I think he says somewhere like the self is freedom. And my sense of that is, if the self is this dynamic process, this dynamic, unstable, unless it's grounded in God, this dynamic, unstable process, that is freedom, because it's just a process. The self is just this process of stuff moving around back and forth between these two poles, trying to stabilize itself. That is freedom, because there isn't any, there isn't any substance there. It's just all process, all dynamic movement. And so that is freedom. And so and I don't know exactly where the will is in there, but I think that you're right that, and I don't know if he just wants to say this because he's coming from this, Augustinian Christian tradition, but I agree. I think he probably thinks, for his purposes, the most crucial aspect of what it means to be a human, a being with an interior life, is to have will, and to have a free will that's there's facticity, I suppose, to use Sartre's term, but it's fundamentally free. And how does he, and if he's right, then maybe his conclusion, if he's right about that, and if there is this God that has these features, then maybe he's right about the whole thing. But I don't know I don't know if he probably would say you can't prove that there's a will like that, or that, I mean, I think he does think that he's given us not exactly a proof. I think he's given us a compelling argument as to why the self is fundamentally this dynamic, ungrounded process. I'm not sure. It seems like Eric gave us an explanation of that one time, what his basic argument for that is, which I've forgotten. So he thinks that he's given us that. Whether that also ends up showing that that process is a will or has a will, I don't know. But then, so that's a big if. That's a huge if, right? And, you know, like Chase said, it seems like a whole lot of his ideas in this book rests on that one claim. But then again, I'm remembering I don't have a clear idea of Schelling and talking about the way, and again, maybe I'm misremembering, but the way that what I am is fundamentally is the emergence of some, I don't know what to call it, almost pre-experiential will that generated this being, this experience. And that it seems to me that Schelling did call it something like will or choice or something. And so there's like this primordial choice that in some sense pre-existed any personal experience of choice I can consciously be aware of. And that primordial choice is what constitutes me as a being. And that's fundamentally perhaps what Kierkegaard is saying. There's some primordial choice, primordial will that brought this self-dynamic relation into being. And maybe he's relying on something like that. But anyway.
Yeah, I think you're getting really to the heart of kind of a lot of these problems that exist in Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer as well, and that Schelling really, I wouldn't say that the problem doesn't exist in Schelling too, but I think he probably dealt with it the best. Basically, this relation of some things seem like they actually have to be outside of time, or at least outside of the conditions of, sorry, I'm going to talk in a very Kantian manner, but outside of the conditions of the possibility of our experience and its actuality, say, maybe Kierkegaard would kind of like that idea. But then in order for that to work, and he talks about it at the beginning, I think it was probably towards like the second seminar that we had, that beginning of that section, he talks about the decision and things like that. I can't remember the terminology used, but he talks about it very much like Schelling in the sense that there's a kind of eternal decision, and then we just kind of play it out, you know, in time. But on one level, there is this kind of eternal choice or something like that, or will, and then you kind of face it in time, I guess. I don't know. Maybe my just reading so much Schopenhauer has just turned my brain into mush, and I can only read Schopenhauer and everything now. I don't know. Maybe that's going on, probably a little. But yeah, the same thing occurs in the sense that, okay, you have to have some kind, okay, his basic presupposition, or my idea of his basic presupposition is that he needs this kind of individual free willing in order for the truths of Christianity, you know, to be true, in the sense that the individual is a sinner who faces God in judgment, and is absolutely different, qualitative difference between those two. That's basically his presupposition. And then he's trying to work out, okay, how does that work really? Basically, the idea that you can, you know, then make decisions kind of in time where there's all these particular relations and things, and everything's this kind of swarming mess of relations, really, then can you really have that absolute freedom that, you know, that his whole system requires, or his, you know, whole Christian system requires that kind of absolute? But yet, once we get into that particularity where, you know, even on a kind of empirical individuality kind of level, you would then start to see, oh, well, but there's, you know, causation and things like that going on. How can you really keep that purity of agency, you know, in this flux? Either you basically lose the agency because of like a determinism kind of thing, or you lose the individuality in the sense of it's some, you know, isolated atomistic thing. You know, either the self is a process that works in this dynamic manner and changes, and then therefore the idea of an eternal judgment and an eternal will and an eternal punishment and all eternity, everything becomes really difficult at that point. So, you know, it's how, I don't think it really works in the end. And I think the way that the end kind of came about kind of showed that ultimately his presupposition didn't really work out, really. But then again, you know, what is the value of this book? I think there's a lot of value to it in the sense of, first of all, just kind of understanding the viewpoint. But then that sounds kind of superficial, but I think he really does a good job of kind of showing almost those paradoxes in a way that is profound, and probably in a way more than I can just like explain at the moment. But yeah, anyways, that's the way I kind of see those problems working. I could go into like Schopenhauer, but I don't want to turn the Kierkegaard seminar into a Schopenhauer seminar, so I'm going to just not.
I mean, one thing that I think is interesting about it, and this is, I guess this is just a move that I like, but, you know, we kind of began a lot of this, or you know, Nevitt sort of injected into a lot of this, a conversation about phenomenology. And a question that I would ask is, okay, so what we're doing is we are speculating as to the nature of our subjective desires, impressions, relations, and actions. And we've been presented two possible different ways of understanding it. One is that there is sort of an atemporal rod that shoots through my entire being and explains why it operates in the way that it does. There is no homoerotic subtext there. You are not thinking about this correctly. The other is that we're like a dynamic process that is, you know, that where my subjectivity is in a relationship with the world. If someone clips that and posts it online, it's gonna make me laugh. Right, but like the question that I would ask is, which one of these interpretations better coheres with our intuitive phenomenological experience of things? And I don't know about the rest of you, but my intuitive experience of my subjectivity is that it happens not that it is this consistent thing that just, you know, happens to have to respond to certain temporal situations, but that it is this my opinions alter, they change things, fundamentally change me. Today, so I went out trying to go to the grocery store, and then I realized they all had like ridiculously long lines, and I was like, they probably don't even have the things I want in there anyways, because the things I need are like bread, and I just doubt somehow that the grocery store has bread based on what people have told me. So I ended up going to this is a totally stupid tangent, but I promise it does vaguely interact with the topic. So I ended up going to Alvin Ord's sandwich shop in order to get a sandwich. And while I was there, like waiting, you know, got my mask on, I might have, I don't know, I'm doing Sudoku on my phone. I'm waiting for them to bring out my sandwich. I see these two people walk in, and they like resemble what I'm going to describe as like beta versions of friends from my time in college. Like they're people who like look like the larval versions of those people. Like they look like those people when I first met them, right? Rather than like the way that they've dynamically changed through time. And I had this like weird spiraling moment where I was thinking about like, oh my God, like I'm this dynamic entity and I've changed. And oh my God, like I was trying to imagine like hanging out with these people now, because I was just sort of assuming that they act like those friends of mine acted like, 7 years ago. And I was like, would I hate them? Would I think they were children? Would I actually enjoy it? Would it be an enjoyable experience in the same way that at the time I was? And right. So like, I mean, that's my entire response to Kierkegaard in a funny sort of way, is just like, and this is actually my response to Kant, because what I do think we see here is there's a consistency between the way that Kant is answering this question, Schelling is answering this question, and Kierkegaard is answering this question. And I think they're answering it in the same way. One, because they know about each other, but two, because it is the only way that you can answer this in a manner that is consistent with Christianity, right? But I don't think that it's loyal to the phenomenological perception of ourselves and our ability to act and our choices. I think that it's trying to be. Sometimes it pretends to be, but I don't think it's loyal to my experience of myself. And that is me saying that is my experience of my own subjectivity. Maybe you guys don't agree, but I would be curious to hear.
It is closer to mine, but what probably the conclusion to draw there is that I grew up in a religious environment similar to Kierkegaard's. And, that's a possibility that he may have universalized his own experience, something like that. So that's a possibility. I wanted to, propose, or not propose, but just throw out a possible combination of Schelling and Kierkegaard that probably misunderstands both of them. But, one of the things that's always just, really, really bothered me about Christianity is this notion of original sin, and which just makes no damn sense. And, when you ask Augustine's like, it's a mystery, which is also no help. But, if I maybe get both these guys wrong, but if Schelling is saying something like there is this primordial, like we talked about in the Schelling seminar, it seems like Schelling is trying to explain why is there anything and why does it look kind of like this from fundamental metaphysical principles. So if you get, and then of course, he's also probably trying to make it conform to certain Christian notions, but if he's trying to give a fundamental metaphysical explanation for why there is a world, why there is a universe, and why it looks this way, and then he thinks that at the core of that process that is existence is this scission, this weird kind of will or decision, I guess, and that somehow ends up giving birth to God in some sense, the God or the Godhead, and then somehow also ends up giving birth to what we experience as individual mental existences. Then in some sense, each individual subjective existence is a manifestation of a primordial choice or event over which we didn't have any control because we are that, or maybe we are the result of that. And maybe, and I don't know how exactly Kierkegaard interprets Genesis and so on, but you might be able to interpret the Genesis story as, I've forgotten what the term is and who used this term, but nostalgia for something that never has been. And so that maybe the garden is nostalgia for a condition of unity with the divine, but maybe our fundamental condition is and always has been the fact that you have this divine movement, from Schelling, and you have these individual upspringings of will that then manifest as us, but they are always from the beginning not unified or not resting in this, more profound divine willing. And so that maybe is then the human condition, that we are these ungrounded, dynamic processes having been produced by these primordial wills. And maybe that's original sin is, it wasn't our choice in the sense that I consciously made this choice. I am the manifestation of some primordial will that now, because then you get the whole thrownness thing, from Heidegger, and abandonment from Sartre, it all harks back to that here you are, I show up in the world and here I am responsible and there's not a damn thing I can do about it. And, those are secularizations, I think, of Kierkegaard's intuition that things are not right. And somehow there is, at the core of my being, I bear or I am made responsible for that by having come into existence. And so anyway, that's just, an attempt to kind of give maybe a way of interpreting Kierkegaard a bit more charitably, as far as what, how we can be responsible for our own fuck-upness.
Just briefly, just super briefly, I swear that's not a lie this time. Nevitt, I was like, I had a brain blast while you were talking. I was like, oh, I see it, the absolute knowing. I was just, thanks. I appreciate it, Sean. You said two things that like immediately clicked to me. And it was this, okay, so Kierkegaard on one end, Schelling on the other, and they kind of meet to in your conception of Kierkegaard's sort of conception of this will, right? And this original sin that we have to take ownership of. So the one thing you said that like opened my third eye. It was when you said this yes, I know, this primordial will or resolve, which is sort of that, like you were talking about, I don't know how much Kierkegaard really talks about Genesis per se, but but that seems to be, as we've kind of puzzled out, there seems to be this will, this will pushing forward our existence, and even at the beginning of our existence, this will as our genesis in some sense. But we can't, you said the thing that really illuminated it was we can't control it because we are it. We are this will. And the way that I think that, I guess my critique, or not my critique, again, I don't want to critique. I'm not a critic. I'm just another member of the band. My only response is that I think that is my reasoning for an argument that I just made up just now, which is that Kierkegaard sets out to take will and, freedom and meaning and all that, and sin and stuff. He tries to take sin down to the level of the individual, and he critiques Hegel for remaining in this realm of the conceptual. But I think in his attempt to do so, he committed the exact opposite, and he leapt into the realm of open concepts and absolutes, and Hegel has maintained a position within the individual, or has stayed true to the individual, which Kierkegaard has failed to do. But here's my reasoning. I think that if we can say that Kierkegaard gives our Genesis, with whatever small pieces of the puzzle that we have of Kierkegaard's description of Genesis in the Bible, as God as the creator, right? God is a creating will. To argue that God is a creative will, and in fact, a will that is centered around order and not confusion, even. Like, he's going very far to argue that God is this orderly will that kind of, in some sense, has some responsibility for the entire universe, has some sort of responsibility for the entire universe. There, in doing that, I think that Kierkegaard, I wrote that down in my notes, and because Nevitt, you say K a lot, but I think that Kierkegaard gives through that move, he gives the will, the initial will, the primordial will, he hands it over, and then thus originary sin, in a sense. He hands originary sin over to God, to this constant, absolute, immutable force that then bestows absolute, originary sin to all of its creations, all of the things that it makes within its image, which are humans, or the things that are capable of sinning, with which he will judge, or upon which he will pass judgment. He bestows this originary sin to all of these things which he will judge. But Hegel would say that the originary sin is there. I don't know if he ever called it originary sin, but it would be real spiffy if he did, because it would really work for my argument, but I don't think he ever did. I think that he would say that the will is this thing that we can't control because we are it. I think, like, basically, Nevitt, my point is, I think you, like, in your description of like Kierkegaard shelling, maybe it's because I have it's like a dog whistle thing. I only hear things that I like to hear, and I ignore all the things that don't fit my dogmatic schema. And so I just heard a lot of Hegelian ideas. And one of them is that we can't control that originary sin because we are it, that will, this arbitration, this completely unprincipled beginning for our thought, and for any sort of discussion of our circumstances. But Hegel would say that in each individual, and this is why I say that Kierkegaard says that the leap of faith is something that must be done, but Hegel says that it's something that we already did. I think that I don't know if Hegel would say that the resolve, the Entschluss, is closer to the originary sin or to the leap of faith. I don't, or maybe it's both, but I just don't know. I haven't thought about it for very long. I just came up with it. But like, I know that for Hegel's logic, to make sense, it has to have a beginning. It has to have some sort of beginning. And that beginning is this meeting point between necessity and impossibility, and mediation and immediacy, which is decision or resolve, the end of end, Entschluss, the end of ending, which comes together in resolve. And that's, for Hegel, he says, in the beginning, there was a decision. But then he clarifies it in much less direct language. He says it was an indeterminate decision, and that was also very indirect and difficult to parse out. But what I think he meant when he said that it was an indeterminate decision is that it decides nothing concretely. So we can't control that decision because we are that decision. We can't control it because it doesn't decide anything concretely. The only thing, the decision that is our beginning, the beginning of all thought in each individual. In each individual, there is a beginning of thought, just the same as there was a beginning of thought in the first man. If we believe that man was shot out of Eden by God, or if man was a monkey that sharpened a rock, there was this beginning of thought, no matter what, that is the same sort of beginning of thought that you have in your individual experience. And that beginning of thought is a decision. And that decision decides that it's the only thing it decides is that it itself has consequences for thought in writ large. These consequences are immediate. There are immediate consequences to a decision deciding that it will be a decision. The beginning, therefore, requires no, or not therefore, but as a part of that, requires no preparation. It's necessary and it's impossible at the same time. It's grounded in nothing. It has an absence of a beginning. And so then he says this in another part, which is slightly more direct. He says the beginning is non-derivable. We can't derive kind of a notion of the beginning with total certainty, which is in line with Kierkegaard arguing that we can never understand God or sin. I think they would agree on that. But it's non-derivable, it's non-analyzable, and it's non-dialectical. There's no Aufhebung of the beginning, which is why I think a lot of Lacanians are really interested in Hegel, because there's this connection of the one thing that's non-dialectical, that's not able to be put into the Aufhebung. So just to finish my spiel, we begin with a decision, an immediate, indeterminate decision incision. And I guess I could talk about that more, but I'm just saying, I guess the only reason I'm saying, yes, the eternally posited past. That's what I was trying to remember. Yes, the never begun beginning, the eternally posited past it's the only thing that we can recognize as our contact with our beginning. is an eternally posited past. It's this indivisible remainder of our attempts to mediate our experience to the point of reaching the beginning and analyzing the beginning. We're never going to get to the true radical, non-concrete deciding decision that is our beginning. But what we can do is we can posit an eternal past. And this is just, I think, used for Hegel as an example of our tendency to slice into eternity and to make things eternal, like math and logic and all kinds of other good stuff. But anyway, yeah. Thank you for letting me talk.
You're welcome. I just kind of want to say something rather glib and superficial, but one thing that so Nivet, you talked about the fact that it seemed like he was kind of hankering back to the good old days, and he has this kind of idea of a lost paradise, almost, kind of, that there's been a fall and whatnot, which of course is exactly what they believe, and I think that's kind of an element that you see not just in kind of what basically what Hunter was talking about just now, but in the sense that he's trying to get to some kind of genesis, some kind of where is like this originary sin, where's this hereditary sin, where is this all coming from, there's some kind of basically like a kind of idealization or a concept of something that is this absolute good, this absolute being, this absolute truth, that is somewhere there, it's in the background, and this is the thing also that basically gives us our own kind of intensification of subjectivity, because we're constantly judging ourselves, or Kierkegaard wouldn't say that probably, but in relation to this, I'm thinking of myself in relation to something that is absolute good, that I kind of came from that in some mysterious way, outside of time, outside of any kind of causal sequence of beginning that I can think of. But then the thing is, there's also this whole kind of very much a sort of reactionary kind of thing going on in his, especially I think in this reading. And I think these are actually related. This is what I realized basically. But so on page 115, he talks about basically when people used to think that being insubordinate to God was actually like a horrifying thing. Even saying the word God is a horrifying thing. But basically he says that everything that in the old days was regarded with horror as the expression of an ungodly insubordination is now regarded as genius, the sign of a deep nature. Thou shalt believe is the old-fashioned phrase. Short and good, as sober as possible. Nowadays, it is a sign of genius and a deep nature not to be able to do so. So he's basically talking like the old man on the porch, like yelling at the kids, back in the old days, nowadays, and I kind of agree with him to a certain extent that things have changed. Not all change is exactly progressive, but then I did just burn us. I mean, really, it's because I know I'm a genius and I know I have a deep nature, so I was really offended by this. And offense is the nature of God, or I don't even know. I'm kind of curious about what is the whole thing of offense is, but anyways, I think that there's something. There's a real connection with his kind of, for lack of a better term, ontology of an ideal of some type, and a fall, which is us, or even time or the present age and all these things. And then this idea of basically judging everything compared to that kind of ideal concept of a universal idea outside of time of the good. So basically it's kind of rehashing Platonism in a way. And I think some of the stuff about the present age, I think, is spot on. And I think almost hardly anyone would argue about some of the stuff that he talks about that's really interesting about conformity and how people want to run away from their individuality in their lives and basically exist in this is all the stuff that Heidegger took. But then again, I think there's also some elements of this that are always going to be setting up actuality in a way that's really demented, because it's never going to be able to live up to this paradise of the ideal time before time and all this, and the good, that is beyond goodness. And this whole, basically, I mean, Christianity got its idea of God from Platonism, basically. I don't think there's much of a really big difference. So I think you have some of these same problems there too. Basically, we need Nietzsche and Deleuze to overturn Platonism in order to make any kind of progress here. That's my final judgment on the offense of Kierkegaard. He is a sinner. I damn him to hell. The end.
Well, I don't remember if I brought it up last time. I think I did in my class. There's several places where Nietzsche says, God on a cross, how ridiculous. So he sort of encapsulates exactly the offense that Kierkegaard wants us to embrace. And I guess what I've been thinking about as you were talking, this sort of nostalgia for a never was. I guess if you want to say, so, at least from a Christian perspective, and maybe several other religious perspectives, this world is obviously messed up. And if it's messed up, you've got to ask why. And if there is a good God, it seems like you have to assume that there was a point in which it was not messed up and then it became messed up. And so, if you go through that process, then maybe you more or less have to postulate this, time period or some time or something when everything was fine. And the way I probably misread Schelling, I got the sort of sense that in Schelling it's like, no, it was really kind of from the very beginning kind of birthed, kind of messed up. But then, and then it just continues on, and then I could kind of fit Kierkegaard into the way I did. But then, nice transition to Nietzsche. He's like, well, why would you call this messed up exactly? I don't see why you would call this messed up. And so, I think that's an interesting, like you said, we need Nietzsche. It's like, well, what's so bad about this? I mean, it's just because you decided you didn't, because you wimpy herd animals don't like living here. That doesn't mean it's bad in some cosmological sense. I'm a wimpy herd animal, by the way. So
this is the superficial comment that's been rattling around in my head almost the entire time. I think in all of the lectures, but related to what you just said, Nevitt, is this is where I really bring in Camus' criticism of Christian existentialism, right? It's Camus' understanding of but he doesn't use Kierkegaard as the example here. He uses a different Christian existentialist who is escaping my brain at the moment. But the fact that you have to, in a sense, right, because you're having to say, God is this good force, and so you somehow have to understand the world as it appears to us as good, or to the extent that it isn't good, you have to understand the corruption as a product of something other than God, or as some other element of what's going on. Camus points to this and just goes, look, this assertion, this conceptualization of how the world has to work, it is fundamentally painted into the corner of having to reconceptualize reality, reconceptualize what we see as morally justifiable. It has to say that the world as it appears to us is in some way good, or somehow moral. And this is betraying every other, right? I mean, we're talking about an eminent critique here. This betrays every other aspect of what Kierkegaard is criticizing here, right? Kierkegaard is coming in and saying, like, our culture is bad. The ways that people are interacting with the one thing that's supposed to give them salvation is bad. Our activities as an individual is bad. But, God is sovereign. And that's nonsense. That doesn't make any sense. That is a total betrayal of every element of our sensation of the world as it appears to us as a thing that is deeply immoral and is in need of some kind of alteration, and need of some kind of change, is in need of some kind of response. And I think that this too, like in a more individualistic way, I think that Sartre is guilty of this. I mean, if we're starting to get into the ways that I think Camus is critical of Sartre, I think that ultimately, like, his appeal to the concept of God, my brain is being dumb. Not false consciousness, but like what's
seriality?
Bad faith.
Bad faith. Thank you. Bad faith.
Okay.
I think his conceptualization of bad faith, right, is essentially like an atheistic version of this explanation of the fall, right? Oh, well, people, have a real there, and they have a real conceptualization of themselves, but like circumstances in the world lead them to deny the truth of the reality that is underneath. And I think that existentialism is making a mistake when it makes this supposition. I think that, like, I think how Nietzsche fits into this picture is a little bit confusing, but I interpret Camus as taking Nietzsche in a very specific direction in terms of a critique of this, which is just to say, look, we are confused. These are incomplete processes. There isn't a distinct, definitive answer to any of this. But that shouldn't turn us off of the project of trying to recognize things as legitimately good and legitimately bad, and trying to respond to them in a real way. And I think that Kierkegaard's response, right, insofar as it like births a certain kind of like reactionary impulse and like a conservatism that can ultimately turn into a kind of fascism under the right circumstances. It is this idea that if we could just go back to the good old days, if we could just get back down to the essentials, rather than recognizing fundamentally that good is an incomplete project that we have to fight for, and if that sort of makes sense.
That makes me think, one value of, when you talk about this sort of implicit extremism in Kierkegaard, actually one value I think in a lot of philosophers that go to an extreme is exactly that. They kind of stake out the boundaries of possibilities in certain ways of thinking. And, I think Kierkegaard makes the most sense of a sort of radical conservative Christianity of anyone I've ever seen. I can't think of any other I mean the theologians not that I know that many that do something similar are drawing on Kierkegaard. And so at least it's like he takes certain conceptions and tries to work them consistently to their logical end. And I think that's a very valuable thing. And then, like we've been talking about, so then what do you have to buy if you're going to accept that? Well, you've got to accept this and that and that, and that's good to know. It's kind of like with Kierkegaard or with Kant. One of the things I think that's great about Kant is he takes certain epistemological and metaphysical issues and runs them out to the end. And you drive things to the end, and this is where you end up. And people are like, well, we don't like that, so let's do something different. But I think that some of these people are really helpful, and they sort of stake out those boundaries like this. So, but I don't know. He still terrifies. I hope when I die, Kierkegaard turns out to have been wrong. because otherwise I'm going to have a miserable eternity.
Yeah, like so one thing that was kind of shocking was at the very end. I mean, it wasn't that shocking, but that he's like, oh, by the way, the worst thing of all is to not actually believe in the divinity of Christ. That's, out of all these things in the entire book, that's the worst thing possible. Like it's almost unthinkable. And then I was like, oh shit, wait, so, oh God. Yeah, so hopefully he's wrong. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's why one reason Kierkegaard terrifies me is because, again, it's like reading the DSM. Is that what it's called? The
diagnostic standards of something like that. I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like reading that. It's like, oh my God, there I am, and there I am, and there I am. And and maybe because he's read so many philosophers, and because he was hanging out with so many philosophers, he knows us. He's like, he just writes us right into his book, and says, you're going to hell, and you're going to hell. And sorry. Well, he's not sorry. I think he's laughing. I think he's there with Tertullian in heaven going, whoa.
Yeah. So one of the things, for him, this God wants order and all this stuff. I don't know. I guess, I know we're after 7, but I really need to, so God wants order, not confusion. And because of this, but then his own kind of establishment, but God's establishment in Christendom, he talks about it as like if it was meant to be a failure. Like, okay, yeah, the concept worked, but then in actuality, it was awful. The God-man concept just didn't really work. What is that God's fault? It's kind of almost seems like it, but you could say like, oh, maybe that's a problem with, just institutions and stuff. But then he's basically seems to be all about the monarchy as an institution. Like there, it's just, oh yeah, these rabble rousers, want to blame God. There's this constant reference to basically God is like a monarch, and you don't question the monarch. That's ridiculous. It's only in this topsy-turvy world where of humans that in the mass public that where we question the monarch or whatnot. And then but then at the same time, like that's exactly what he's doing against Christendom. He's speaking out against these established institutions. So I don't know, kind of doesn't really seem to totally work there for me. But yeah, I'm pretty sure Kierkegaard is wrong, and I'm pretty sure there's no hell. Probably, I'm going to go with that. I don't. Is there an afterlife? I don't know. I think if there is some kind of an afterlife, it'd be maybe like pantheism, not pantheism necessarily, but panpsychism is true. Then kind of we just switch levels and just kind of go towards a more kind of dispersed level, and we're just like conscious as worm food and all this fun stuff. I guess we can talk about this on Sunday when we talk about Ulysses, which we couldn't do last week. Yeah, so yeah, there we go. That's my final statement, which I'm pretty sure that's like my third final statement for the day. So yeah.
Like Eric said, he doesn't say much about the afterlife in general, although there seem to be places toward the end of this book when he used the word eternal that he was kind of gesturing to that. So, earlier in the book, eternal seemed to always be, like an aspect of the human self or a feature of the divine. But in this book, later he seems to be talking about our eternal destiny, to put it in the traditional sense. Let's see, what church should we go to?
Ulysses Church.
Maybe one of those Satanist churches. That would.
I've been to some parties with them. They're pretty chill folks. When what's his name from the religious department, who wrote the book on vampires.
Laycock.
Yeah, Laycock. Laycock's awesome, and I went to his party that he did for his book with about the Satanists, and they were pretty chill folks. I'd be down for that.
Awesome. Yeah, I wrote a recommendation for Laycock to get some kind of professorship. I'm guessing he didn't get it because I didn't hear anything back. So sorry. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, he's awesome though. Yeah. Satanists are awesome too. Actually, I have some critiques against some aspects of Satanism, especially the ones that are their ethics are basically just egoism, which I think is stupid. But yeah, that's another topic.
Okay.
Thanks, Travis. Judgment.
So I guess we're done. Well, for now anyway, with Kierkegaard. On to Nietzsche. I feel so bad. I want to hide my face. I'm so sorry about the book thing. Kierkegaard books, now that we're done, are supposed to be here. I ordered the Nietzsche like 2 or 3 weeks ago, but then there was the apocalypse, and so I don't know what happened there. So and our bad boy Chase has provided something that I shall not mention on the recording.
Yeah, go to the Discord, the
right.
Nietzsche channel. It's there.
So and then I think either me or Chase posted the reading schedule on Discord also. So we're going to go through all of the genealogy, including the misogynistic passage, the misogynistic sections that I excised from our class. We had to excise something. I thought, I really don't want to deal with this. Instead, I posted a couple of essays on Canvas for the class written by feminists about Nietzsche, which, believe it or not, there are significant number of feminist Nietzscheans, one of whom is at University of Texas. So,
do I have to read those?
No.
Sweet.
I just put them there so that if someone goes, I was reading these sections and what the hell is going on? I say, go read those essays and leave me alone. That's basically why I put them up there.
So, yeah, I like the part in Kierkegaard where he called something womanish. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, he's like, I don't want to be like the womanly or anything, fellows, but hear me out, you know?
Yeah, I think in our translation it was effeminate. Effeminate, yeah.
Our translation, I'm pretty sure, literally said womanish.
That was actually, so in a translation of Plato's Republic, that's what Socrates says, that like poetry is bad because it causes people to act womanish. That was the translation we had, yeah. Like, yeah, these people think it's so great to like tragedy, but these people just act womanish. And it makes, the part of the soul that makes people act womanish, well, that's obviously bad. So therefore poetry's bad. Therefore, yeah, not in our city. That's your boy Plato right there, yeah.
So, I've heard that Greeks, that culture in general, thought of women as, at least one popular thought was women as defective men. Did Plato and Aristotle go along with that?
Aristotle once said to be woman is to be without.
Aristotle was definitely on that train. I hear a lot more debate about Plato just because of the way that he does things in the Symposium. But I would probably I guess I wouldn't say that Plato isn't sexist as much as Plato's sexism is a little bit more complicated in a way that is interesting. Whereas this with Aristotle, it just is what it is.
Yeah,
Plato makes women guardians, makes them warriors. So,
well, I mean, potentially they can become the golds, right? They can become.
I think so.
Yeah, like big because of their maternal instinct gets them. They can guard us.
I mean, it's he explicitly says yeah, they're going to make babies, but the babies are going to go in the nursery and they're going to go back to work. They're going to go back to the gym and go do all that fighting and
I thought he said something, and this might just be me misremembering, about like that the Golds aren't allowed to have sex until they are no longer capable of reproduction. So like once women hit menopause, then they can have as much sex as they want. I could be totally misremembering, but I feel like I remember that from the Republic.
I think Travis' expression says it all right there. Yeah.
I do remember a passage when he's talking about the so-called marriage among the guardians, where he does say past a certain age you can have as much sex as you want. I don't remember if it had to do with fertility or not, but I always in class I'm always like, woohoo, there you go. But
I remember it having to do with reaching menopause,
okay.
because at that point you don't have Golds having children and thus threatening the stability of the philosophical order, because I mean, I guess this is like literally centuries later, but stupid what is it, Aurelian Marcus, the Stoic boy, makes his son emperor, who's an idiot, and then it's just all downhill from there for the Roman Empire, right? He Marcus is like the last of the line of the 5 good emperors, but then he chooses his fail son to be emperor. But anyways, now I'm just litigating gripes with history.
I think there's definitely a lot of problems in Roman history before then. I'm going to go with that. Yeah, maybe.
No, it was all perfect.
Okay,
Julius
idyllic
Caesar,
past. Yeah,
perfect boy. Did nothing wrong. I don't understand what the stabbings was about. I think that it was a little BS.
Fake news.
Fake.
Totally agree. Yeah. That was probably just the rabble rouser public trying to, overthrow the king. So.
Oh no, it wasn't even that. I mean, the people they rightly loved Caesar. The problem was the pernicious, destabling forces of unsavory individuals in our society who are plotting against our divine rulers.
When people tell me that drunk driving is bad, I just tell them that they're the chatter of Das Mon trying to put me down, and I'm trying to live my Das Ein as authentically as possible by drunk driving. Now I'm hungry.
Wow.
Is this the Hegelian version of the drill tweet?
Dude!
Heidegger, yeah.
Or the Heideggerian, sorry.
Stop telling me to not drunk drive.
Look, drunk driving, it kills people, but it also gets lots of people to work on time. So you can't say whether or not it's good or bad. We just can't know.
That's true. Think about the economy. Yeah.
I hate the economy. I think that the economy's bad, and anything that's good for it is evil. But except for me going out and buying Whataburger right now with Travis because he loves me and wants to buy Whataburger with me because he's hungry.
I think you should buy Whataburger for you.
That's a great idea.
For the judgment and the subjective intensification of suffering that he's inflicted on all of us. And I think he should buy Hunter, The Phenomenology of Spirit by Cambridge Press.
I agree.
No, actually, no, never mind.
No.
Only if he buys me the orange.
The Texas State
one.
Philosophy Department should. Sorry.
Travis, I will gift you this, because at this point, because I read a PDF of this book a long time ago, and I just have this because of the funny cover, because it makes me laugh when I go, it's the meme. I like the A.V. Miller, but I haven't read a single page. Well, actually, that's not true. I've read like 30 pages, but I have not of like the text itself. That's the preface is like fucked up. It's really long. But anyway,
I'm just gonna tape it to my wall.
There's a summary in the back. I want to just do that.
Yeah, let's just read the summary. Fuck it. Who gives a
I'm gonna
shit?
rip out all the pages and paste them all over my wall so that you can't see anything but Hegel.
Yeah, like losing your mind.
I have a suspicion that that's what Hunter's room looks like.
What?
You can see it.
Like, yeah, right outside a frame, or because I've always kept it dark, but I have it on right now because I wanted to do the chase thing where I have a book, look at it. I wanted to do that. And the only way I could do this is if I turn the lights on. So fuck you. Okay.
Oh, what is that?
That's my liver scan. I thought you might want to see
is
my
your
liver.
okay?
Not that great. My liver's not in that great shape, but
Oh.
basically it told me I need to lose a hell of a lot of weight.
Oh. just hang in there at least until after Hegel, at least, you know.
Yeah.
It'll be good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I've got that too, yeah.
Wait, do we all have an A.V. Miller copy? Except for Travis, because he's a fucking idiot. Ooh, okay. Hey, okay. I've had fun. How about you guys?
Yeah.
Yeah. What?
One last thing. I'm sorry. I feel okay. I'm sorry. I made the decision that I was like, oh, I have to say this before the end, but that was a long time ago. It's probably like way past its due now, but
Yes.
I'm going to remake the schedule for the literature seminar. That's all I want to say. Yeah. Because
why? Because of last week or for some other reason?
Yeah, because we missed last week, basically. Yeah.
You're not going to just shift it out a week?
No, I am, but there's a few other problems with it that I noticed. So I basically just need to remake it. I just want to say that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, bye.
Ah!